Welcome to Prescription for Justice. My name is Martin Donahue. Today's topic is women in science, and I have two accomplished, thoughtful guests to explore this area with me following my introductory comments. Throughout history, outside of a few small matriarchal societies, women have been marginalized and had limited opportunities for formal academic learning, and yet, in many societies, they have been the ones who have promulgated knowledge about the natural world to the next generation. Regrettably, most of these women remain nameless, and over the last few millennia, science has been a male-dominated enterprise, despite the important accomplishments of individuals like Ada Lovelace, the first computer programmer, Marie Curie, the first woman to win not one but 2 Nobel Prizes for her work on radiation, and Rosalind Franklin, who helped elucidate the structure of DNA. This male dominance slowly changed with the democratization of reading after the invention of the printing press. Advancements in obstetrics, anesthesia, and contraception, the right to vote, thanks to Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and other suffragists, and increasing opportunities for formal education and advancement in the workplace. Despite ongoing legal, political, educational, and social marginalization of women, their rights have evolved dramatically, albeit much too slowly, over the last few centuries. For instance, French playwright and feminist and anti-slavery activist Olympia de Gouges authored one of the earliest declarations of women's rights, which stated, "Woman is born free and lives equal to man in her rights." For her efforts, she was executed. In the United States, women were not allowed to vote until 1920 and not permitted to serve on juries in all 50 states until 1975. In 1972, Congress passed the Equal Rights Amendment, yet only 35 of the 38 needed states ratified the amendment before its 1982 deadline. In 1974, Congress outlawed housing discrimination based on sex, and while Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act includes a prohibition against employment discrimination based on sex, and Title IX of the 1972 Education Amendments prohibits such discrimination in education programs that receive federal support, discrimination still exists. On the positive side, since 1993, the Family and Medical Leave Act has allowed workers unpaid time off, job security, and continued benefits for up to 12 weeks. This has been especially beneficial to women as they provide the bulk of child and elder care. Even so, it covers only 60% of working women. In 1994, Congress adopted the Gender Equity in Education Act to train teachers in gender equity, promote math and science learning by girls, counsel pregnant teens, and prevent sexual harassment. And in 2009, the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Restoration Act extended the time limit for litigation covering pay discrimination. Today, worldwide, women do 2/3 of the world's paid and unpaid work, receive 10% of global income, and own just 1% of global property. Women hold 23% of legislative seats. There are only 20 female heads of state. Women make up 45% of the employed global workforce, yet account for 70% of the world's poor. Women in the U.S. working full-time make 79 cents on the dollar, compared with males, a figure unchanged from the 1960s, even though extensive research has shown that equal pay leads to higher profit margins and stock prices, more innovation, and better risk management. The U.S. ranks 65th in gender pay gap. While women make up about half of the U.S. workforce, they hold only 5% of CEO positions and less than 20% of corporate director slots in Fortune 500 companies. Even so, the number of female-owned businesses has increased significantly and now stands at about 30%. Today, women hold less than 1/4 of the jobs in science, technology, engineering, and math, or STEM fields. And yet, women comprise 51% of college graduates, 1/2 of medical school applicants, 1/2 of medical students, almost 1/2 of resident physicians, and 1/3 of the physician workforce. Unfortunately, women are underrepresented in academic medicine. A 2011 study found that female physician salaries were 40% below those of male physicians, while a 2016 study of academic physicians showed an 8% disparity after adjustment for age, years of experience, specialty, reported work hours, and faculty rank. Recently, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine reported that gender-based harassment is pervasive in universities and medical schools, although increasingly recognized and confronted, with some high-profile abusers being forced to retire. The growing influence of the Me Too movement, spurred on by revelations of malfeasance by numerous celebrities and by the misogynistic rhetoric, actions, and policies of President Trump and his administration, provides an opportunity for women to achieve greater levels of opportunity and safety. So, there is good news and bad news for women in general, and women in science in particular. But the best news is that science is, well, fun. It is the process whereby humans work collaboratively to observe, experiment, and learn more about our world, its geologic history, how chemicals interact to produce the diversity of life, how numbers and shapes and patterns explain the workings of the mind and can be used to construct bridges and skyscrapers, how stars and planets form, and how an understanding of the human body and its derangements can be translated into therapies to improve and extend life. It involves mystery, discovery, frustration, drama, sometimes comedy, and has the potential to unite and advance us as a species. Today, many individuals and groups are working to improve science education for women, increase the numbers of women entering STEM careers, publicize the accomplishments of female scientists, provide role models, and eliminate discrimination and harassment in academia and the workplace. Today, I am pleased to have as my guests Dr. Allison Schaser, President of Women in Science Portland, and attorney Laura Stadum, Director and Title IX Coordinator in the Affirmative Action and Equal Opportunity Department at Oregon Health and Science University. Welcome to both of you, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Tell me a little bit, and we'll start with you, Allison, about yourself and your role models.
Well, as you said, I am a PhD. I have my doctorate in communication sciences and disorders. And I also have a clinical background as a speech pathologist. So I'm licensed to practice here in Oregon. I don't currently practice, but I could if necessary. And my research currently is at Oregon Health and Science University. I'm doing a postdoctoral fellowship there. And in particular, I'm studying Parkinson's disease. So my background in my graduate work was looking at voice and swallowing disorders. That's why my communication sciences and disorders background comes into play. And I looked at normal aging processes and how our voice and swallowing mechanisms change with age and then with exercise. And while doing that work, I worked a lot with clients who had Parkinson's disease and realized that swallowing and voice problems were also an issue there with that disorder. And so I wanted to learn more about the pathophysiology, how Parkinson's starts, why it might target voice and swallowing, and then how we might as researchers intervene to try to fix those problems, because they really are debilitating for patients. And eating and talking are social activities, and we want to make sure that people have long, healthy lives and are able to do the things that they want to and communicate and eat and socialize with their families. So that's currently what my research is focused on. And then I have many role models. Luckily, communication sciences and disorders is predominantly female populated. We have a lot of female speech pathologists, and all through my graduate work, I had wonderful female mentors. And so I had a little bit of a culture shock when I stepped away from that field and entered neurology. I wasn't used to there not being women in high profile positions and not running labs and having those, and everyone around me in graduate work was a very successful, educated, wonderful woman. And so kind of stepping back into this other field, I realized that's not the norm. And it was a little bit of a shock for me, which is why I wanted to get involved in women in science, because I love being around strong, powerful women. And this group really has a lot of strong, powerful women. And so for me, it was important to have my research focus at OHSU, but also to have a community and to have more women in leadership positions in this field as well.
Great. And I want to come back to what women in science are doing. I can tell you the enthusiasm is radiating off of you. Which captures for me the excitement of science. Laura, how about you?
Yeah, well, Allison always has a lot of energy, which is why she's so great to be around. So I serve as the director of the Affirmative Action and Equal Opportunity Department at OHSU. And our department looks into concerns related to unlawful discrimination and harassment. So to provide a space for people to report and for us to investigate those concerns related to discrimination and harassment. The other part of my role is as Title IX coordinator, and as you mentioned, Title IX is the federal law that prohibits discrimination and harassment. based on sex or gender in educational programs and activities. So because OHSU is an educational program that receives federal financial assistance, we're required to comply with Title IX, and I oversee compliance with that program. So we provide we work to provide equal access to education and work, and the Affirmative Action Equal Opportunity Department works and supports women in science, and I'm also the secretary of the Women in Science Board, so I work with Allison in that capacity as well.
That's a lot. That's a lot of work.
Yeah. Well, we've been very busy, especially as you mentioned. The Me Too movement has brought a lot of attention to these topics, which we see as a real positive. We're seeing a lot more folks come forward with reports. That doesn't mean it didn't exist before. It just means that people are starting to voice what's been going on. So we're trying to help prevent and respond to those issues as they're coming up. And you mentioned women leaders and women mentors and role models, and I'm really lucky at OHSU because we have several women leaders in high executive roles, including our Chief Administrative Officer, Connie Seeley, our legal counsel. We also have a female Chief Medical Officer and Dean of the School of Medicine, as well as our provost. So we have several women leaders that have been real champions of this work and have made my job a lot easier by helping execute.
Right, that's great to hear. Tell me, and again, I think we'll go in the same order if that's okay, what are some of the barriers to cultivating an interest in science among both young girls and adult women today?
Well, I think some of those initial barriers happen around the ages of like 11 to 15 for young girls. So initially, when you look at younger girls in the schools, they're just as interested in science as the boys. They have that curiosity, that natural curiosity we all have about understanding our world and wanting to get involved. And so when you look at the research from younger ages, there really isn't a difference. But then when you start to get into those middle school, into early high school ages, that's when some of those cultural kind of biases that we have, where women are not necessarily seen in science fields, kind of start to come in, and young girls start to think, oh wait, maybe I'm not supposed to like this. Maybe I'm not supposed to like science and math. Do I see other people around me liking science and math that look like me? Are my teachers in science and math women? Are they not? And when you don't have those role models, you sometimes start to question if that is what you should be doing. And so I think some of that is going away. I'm hoping some of that is going away, but it's also in kind of the world around us, in the TV, in the social media, in the toys, and the things presented to girls around those ages. A lot of it is pink and a lot of it is makeup based, and especially even when you look at science kits for girls, it's make yourself some makeup, and that is how we get involved in science as women, and that to me is part of the problem. So women don't see themselves as, or young girls don't see themselves as basic scientists, and so some of the things we're working to do as an organization are to keep cultivating that interest and that curiosity in science in young girls and show them that all throughout their life they have opportunities to engage in science. And I think when we get in there and we reach them at that young age, then the opportunities are there throughout. When you think about women in the workforce, as you saw from some of your statistics, women are getting in. They're in medical school, they're getting their PhDs, they're in there with the men at equal opportunity at that stage. The problem is that a pay gap still exists, and the problem is that leadership gaps still exist. So women aren't able to make the same amount as men just coming out of the programs for whatever reason. And then they're also not given opportunities to move forward. And I think some of that comes from stereotypes of women also being then in charge of family life. And so there's always a work-life balance for women, but that work-life balance doesn't necessarily happen for men. And so I think some of that can be frustrating as well.
Right. It's funny because as you'll see at the end of the program, I've encountered that a little bit now as a privileged white male who also happens to be a single and sole parent of a 4.5-year-old. I have really no right at all to complain. But it's very true, having read parental leave policies and so on. And it is quite difficult. And you talked a little bit about the way science is presented to young kids. I see that even in the cartoons. Bob the Builder versus, he builds bridges and buildings, whereas you're right, a chemistry set is more about making pretty things. So, Laura, what do you think are some of the barriers and maybe even myths that we encounter?
I think Allison covered a lot, but I would also add sort of the systemic barriers, not having paid parental leave when women or men need to take time off to take care of a sick child or family member, or after pregnancy or birth. The other things that we hear a lot are just those unconscious biases where women are systemically excluded from conversations or dismissed. So I might bring an idea to the table and that will get passed over, but then 60 seconds later my male counterpart might raise the same idea and get all the praise. So trying to acknowledge those things when we see them, and I think we're becoming better at it as a society, but we need to do better, and we need to keep holding everyone accountable to those, because that's not just men playing a part in creating those biases or those systemic issues. It's all of us. So being willing to call it out and say, hey, that was a great idea, Allison, that you just stated 60 seconds ago, Bill, Right.
And I think parental encouragement is also very important. But I remember seeing some studies about where they would just do classroom observations and how often the teachers, usually men, but women too, would call on the boys instead of on the girls when they raised their hands. And so when you're shut out from that initial conversation, you tend to become less and less interested. But the nice thing about science, and I think one of the things that both of you are supporting, especially women in science, is that it is a collaborative venture. And getting men and women to respect each other and value each other from the earliest age possible is very important. Talk a little bit about this salary differential. I think I'll throw that. Would that be a better question for you or Allison?
Yeah, I think we could both talk about it.
Okay.
So
I'll start with you then, this time. The salary differentials, and while you're at it, maybe even talk about some of the issues surrounding harassment and how that's being dealt with today, and maybe at your own institution too.
Sure. So we did talk about, or you mentioned that there is a $20,000 salary gap, and that's sort of seen across the industry. So not just women in science, but women in general are paid less than men. In terms of what that's rooted in, we talked about systemic issues, but also just I think there are laws being put in place to help combat these. So we have an equal pay bill that's just recently been signed by our governor, Kate Brown. So we'll soon be required to pay men and women equally for equal work. That's already a basic premise that we have, but Kate Brown supporting that.
And is that for all occupations, or is that limited to
all occupations? So there's also with there was another law, and I can't remember what it's called right now, but where the Appraised Pay Transparency Act. So I can speak freely and ask Allison, what are you getting paid for your work, and we can't be punished or retaliated against for talking about our salaries. So there are more laws being put in place right now to protect women and folks in the under-marginalized folks in the workforce to talk about their salaries and to talk about their work. So in terms of discrimination and harassment, these are things that have been going on for years. I think what we're finding now is that people their threshold, their tolerance level, and their threshold for tolerating these things it's lowering, and we're finding strength in numbers, and more people are coming forward, which we see as a positive indicator. So we want people to report. We want people to feel comfortable reporting. And at OHSU, we're doing a lot of work to remove barriers to reporting, to getting people to come forward with their stories. So recently, we've applied for a Department of Justice grant that will fund a full-time confidential advocate where people can report confidentially to this person who's been trained in our policies and can get information about what the next steps look like if they were to come forward with a report, which is a huge concern that people have. You know, who's going to know about this? What could potentially happen to me? What protections do I have?
Right.
So
I imagine fear of retaliation is probably
huge.
a significant factor in underreporting. Are there individuals and even groups that support women who come forward, both at OHSU and nationally? If say I'm being discriminated against in academia, whom would I turn to?
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons that we've applied for this grant to fund an advocate, so that we can have someone who could be a resource for that person. Nationally, I mean, I think a group like Women in Science would provide a lot of support for someone who might be going through that experience, and could talk about what the reporting process looked like at their organization or institution, and just to say, hey, was this normal? I think a lot of people have that question. That felt off to me. And then just to be able to talk about their experience and get some other input, and just to feel validated.
Right, right. And I want to give you a chance to respond to that question also, Allison.
Yeah, well, I think Laura did an amazing job talking about the actual legal aspects of it, and the fact that we're starting to put policies in place where we can get rid of this pay gap. But I think part of that pay gap comes from this systemic idea that, you know, women weren't considered equal to men in a lot of different ways, and men are in leadership positions and they're not realizing the effects of this, and so they don't realize that there's a problem. And so until women can stand up and say, you know, we have the data to support the fact that there is this $20,000 unexplained pay gap. It doesn't have anything to do with specialty. It doesn't have anything to do with years of training. It doesn't have anything to do with the fact that I am taking maternity leave. It has nothing to do with any of these factors. It's you come out fresh from your degree and you automatically make $20,000 less. It has nothing to do with your skills.
Right.
And so,
I should clarify just for a moment that the 20,000 is the same as 8%. It's
Yes.
just a testament to the fact that physicians are paid embarrassingly well. So that 8% difference, it does amount to $20,000. Regardless of the overall amount, whether you're a physician or your pay gap is, say, if you're a humanities professor, that gap is significant.
Right.
And it's wrong.
Right.
So I'm sorry I interrupted.
Oh, no, that's a great clarification. And I think, you know, when Laura was also talking about harassment and these issues of discrimination, part of that comes because of these systemic problems with leadership inequities and also pay inequities. And so when people feel like they have power because they're paid more and because they are actual in leadership positions, there's this unconscious bias for them to have this power over another individual. And so until we fix that problem at the systemic institutional level of making sure that women are at the same level as men in terms of pay and leadership, I think that those problems with discrimination and harassment are going to be there. And until we fix that, that's how we're going to even things out.
And how do we do this? Well, more specifically, what is Women in Science doing? Because I don't want to miss out on the opportunity for you to talk about your group.
Right.
And maybe in your answer, glance briefly on the National Academy of Sciences, and are they doing enough, if you could?
Yeah. So in terms of what we as Women in Science are doing, specifically for issues of harassment and making sure that there's equality, is we're letting women have a place to talk about their issues. There is a community aspect of Women in Science that's really important. So a lot of what we do is establish networking events, when we also establish programs so women can feel like they have the opportunities to move up into leadership positions. We want to make sure that when we get young girls interested in science, keep them there, but not only keep them at those levels, but let them have a chance to move up. So a lot of how you move up is through networking. So we do a lot of networking events. We also do a lot of professional development. So we run a negotiation boot camp. It's one of our most highly sought after programs. We actually have a wait list for that one because we do small groups and we really get a chance for women to work together and kind of have discussions about how do you negotiate anything in your daily life? And then if you can negotiate in your daily life, how then can you do that in your job? And so that's one way we're working to try to even out this equity imbalance that's there. We also do some collaboration with Laura's group and try to make sure that that's happening at an OHSU institutional level as well. We want to have more programs dealing with unconscious bias and importance of diversity in science. And so we partner with the Alliance for Visible Diversity in Science, which is a group at OHSU. And we're really working hard there to also form a community that's not just about women in science, but also marginalized groups throughout science. And so I think what you were mentioning before, how do we fix this problem? Part of it is just opening the eyes to the problem exists. So this idea of unconscious bias is real. And we all have our biases. It's not just that men are biased towards women or women are biased towards other things. Like, we all have these unconscious feelings when we think about something. And sometimes it just takes opening our eyes and kind of pushing open that door and saying, oh my gosh, I have that thought. I need to fight that thought and realize that it's not a true thought. And I think a lot of what we're trying to do at institution level is bring up these conversations so that we're not, making men out to be the evil entity. That's not the case at all. We're just wanting to make sure that men have the chance to understand that some of their actions come across in different ways, and we want to make sure that that's clear.
And certainly not wanting to talk over you.
Oh, no, yeah.
The last thing I want to do on this program, I'm going to take the last minute here to mansplain, I suppose, or offer my conclusions on the topic that you're obviously much more expert on than I am. And I do want to encourage our viewers to go to the Women in Science website. They have a mixer coming up, I understand.
Yep.
Men are invited.
Yes, please. We would love more men to come to our mixer. Yes.
So just some concluding comments. There is nothing inherent in the scientific enterprise that should put women at a disadvantage other than closed minds, antiquated beliefs, and inadequate social policies. And while the epidemic of scientific denialism and fake news threatens the scientific enterprise, we have made it through a much worse dark ages. And ultimately the truth will prevail, and I'm convinced that women will lead the next scientific revolution. Of course, as the sole parent, as I said, of a delightful 4.5-year-old girl whose open-minded wonder is the ideal trait necessary for success in science, I have a vested interest in seeing this happen. Of course, if she finds her path in the arts and humanities, however, I would be equally proud and delighted. Thank you both immensely. We'll have to do this again and delve deeper into the topics because these are very important issues. I'd like to direct our viewers also to the Public Health and Social Justice website, where all the open access PowerPoints can be used with appropriate citation by anyone. There is an entire page devoted to women's health, and I'm sure there are many more resources available from you, Allison, and if they want to go to OHSU, is there a website for your department?
AAEO, ohsu.edu/AAEO.
Okay, /AAEO. Thanks again. This has been Prescription for Justice. We'll look forward to seeing you on our next episode. My daughter Madeline has joined us. You want to say hi to our viewers, Maddie?
Hi.
Why don't you introduce yourself, tell them how old you are?
My foot was stuck.
Oh, now it's not
there you
stuck.
Like that.
Tell everyone your name.
Maddie.
And what are your nicknames?
Oh, come on, you tell him.
Okay, Bugs, Mrs. Bugs, Chops, Mrs. Chops, and of course the professor. Who have you got with you?
This is Estrella, and this is Blitz.
What's the difference between a unicorn and an alicorn?
Oh, a unicorn only has a horn. It's a pony with a horn.
Oh.
And an alicorn is a pony with wings and a horn. And a pegasus is a pony with wings.
Are they all good ponies?
Yes.
Oh, okay. And
I
are there?
want to have an alicorn for a pet.
That sounds like it would be fun.
Are you the greatest thing since sliced bread?
Yes.
And that's our show. Thanks again to Madeline, to Allison, to Laura. We'll see you next time.